I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome you to our webinar, the Farm Bill Past, Present, and Future. At Granular, we're committed to serving landowners and farmers and their partners by providing technology and information to help folks operate more efficiently, profitably, and sustainably. And of course, getting information and insights on farm policy can be important to the success of any farm operation, as we know, and policy changes can influence the risks and returns associated with farming, and that in turn can impact farmland values and markets. So we're just thrilled to have Jonathan Koppas as our featured speaker today. Jonathan is director of the Gardner Agricultural Policy Program and Bach Ag Law and Policy Program in the Department of Ag and Consumer Economics at the University of Illinois. Previously, he served as chief counsel for the U.S. Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry, and as administrator of farm programs for the USDA Farm Service Agency. So he's certainly an expert on American farm policy and author of the recently released book entitled The Fault Lines of Farm Policy, A Legislative and Political History of the Farm Bill. So we're thrilled to have Jonathan here today. In terms of our agenda, what we will go over, in addition to key elements of the 2018 Farm Bill, we'll learn a brief history of the Farm Bill and any lessons that we can learn from the history of farm policy. We'll talk a little bit about what next generation farm programs might look at, and then end with what might matter most to farmers, landowners, and their partners. So welcome, Jonathan. It's great to have you here today.
Well, thank you, Leanne and Jet, and to the entire Granular team for having me on board for a webinar this morning, and to everybody that has signed in and participating. As Leanne said, we'll do a quick run through of some of this material, and certainly as we go, ask your questions. And if there's anything that certainly needs to be cleared up as we go, please let us know that as well, and I'll try to clear up anything that acronym-wise or whatnot that is uncertain or unclear. So we want to go ahead and get started. You know, as a brief sort of think through for this, obviously we're talking about policy and legislation, so we are in the realm of politics, and the 2018 Farm Bill experience is no stranger to the politics that we've seen, particularly in recent years. So we can briefly think about what we see, right? And this is the 2018 midterm election map as produced by the New York Times online site. And of course, something we're very familiar with, the reds and blues denoting the partisan makeup of the districts as they were voted in 2018. And of course, as we hear often about the significantly polarized political environment that we're in. And that, of course, is going to have some impact on a farm bill. What we do know is that this farm bill on final passage was strongly bipartisan vote. Here's a breakdown of the House of Representative votes following the usual red and blues for Republican and Democrat respectively, and of course the Senate vote. And that final passage was 87-13 in the Senate and 369-47 in the House. And this is for a $1 trillion bill. Roughly speaking, the cost of this bill over a 10-year period is estimated by the Congressional Budget Office. But we see a strong bipartisan vote. And so in these polarized times, there are some important lessons to learn. And maybe the single most important one that also has a long history to it is this coalition that we've built around the Farm Bill, the coalition in Congress that allows us to cobble together bipartisan votes to get passage in both the House and the Senate. And this is built largely out of a traditional farm coalition. Here looking at the traditional crop regions for corn, cotton, and wheat. Representing the Midwest, the South, and the Western Plains, respectively. Of course, we've added food assistance. This really begins in the 1960s and early 1970s. This would be what used to be called the Food Stamp Program, or is now referred to as a Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. And finally, we see the coalition, that sort of three-part coalition that really is behind farm bills now. Beginning in the mid-'80s, when the environmental and conservation folks were brought into the bill through policies that they were concerned about. So this is how we get our bipartisan votes, and frankly, how we're able to move this kind of legislation through Congress roughly every 5 years, which is no small accomplishment in its own right. So where are we in the 2018 Farm Bill? If we step back, the previous bill, as we said, these tend to be written for a 5-year operating window. The previous bill was signed into law in February of 2014. And at that time, the Congressional Budget Office gave us a score. The score is their estimate of what the programs in that bill with mandatory funding. So that are the commodity programs, the farm programs, the conservation programs, nutrition, and crop insurance. And largely what they do is they estimate how those are going to operate using price and yield forecasts and economic forecasts. And it is that cost estimation that we work off of. And if this chart then compares what they thought it was going to spend when it passed in 2014 with what we've actually seen it spend over the 5 years it's been in operation. And look, any farmers out there know all too well that that we've seen a significantly lower run of prices, a relatively lower run of prices for the major commodities. And so as those prices have been in this lower environment, we see spending in the Title I farm programs, the red bar there, has increased over time. Because we've had great weather years and strong yields, then we can certainly see the purple bar for crop insurance almost offsetting in some respects the increase in spending in Title I. And this is because the insurance programs are running at a lower loss ratio, so fewer indemnities paid out with good crop years and less cost. And as prices come down, we're insuring crops that are less expensive. So the premium costs and the subsidy, premium subsidy involved with that have also decreased in spending. The green bars represent our conservation programs. Those have just been trimmed back a little bit by appropriators each year. And then finally, the big change in spending has been in the nutrition programs and the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program in particular, which had seen increased spending in the wake of the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. And then as the economy has improved, while there is a significant time lag, slowly over time, fewer people were below the poverty line. And as they come above the poverty line, then they're not eligible for the program assistance. And so we see fewer people in the program and a far reduced level of spending than we expected even in 2014. And then finally, I've added the Market Facilitation Program Payment. That's MFP there on the side. This was not in the 2014 Farm Bill. USDA did this using long-standing authorities that they have to create a separate program in response to the tariff situation initiated by the administration, and to try to offset some of the price hit that farmers have experienced in the last year. So that's that unexpected black bar there in 2018, excuse me, at the end of the title. As we look ahead, or as we look back at the 2018 Farm Bill, looking ahead at that time, one of the things that is a key driver of policy development today is the Congressional Budget Office baseline. Under budget rules that Congress has passed, and we'll hit on a little bit later, CBO is required to take the programs as they exist at the time of the estimation and run them out for 10 years and say, this is what we think these programs will cost over the next 10 years. That's represented by the chart here on the screen. And it's that baseline then that drives the reauthorization process. So the Senate and House Ag committees cannot exceed the spending that they have in the baseline. So you can think of this as a very zero-sum sort of competitive issue. If I wanted to increase spending, if I wanted to change a program to increase, say, conservation programs, what the baseline restriction requires is that I cut somewhere else. And so it's that offset requirement that can get a bit tricky when the politics intrude on the policy writing process. As I mentioned, crop prices have been down from where we thought they were going to be when this Farm Bill, the 14 Farm Bill, was written. And then this chart maps what has happened over the course of 2018 in particular. So this has been the time frame in which Congress was debating a Farm Bill, and the time frame in which the administration was using tariff policies to impact trade agreements and negotiations. And we can see just sort of marched across here, and we've had some articles on Farm Doc Daily talking about what we've seen between the tariff implemented by the Trump administration and then retaliation from some of our trading partners, most notably China, and it's really weighed down on soybean prices in particular. That combined with a really great crop year in which we saw strong yields and a high amount of production has weighed down prices. And so it was this that the administration responded to in 2018, making these MFP, these Market Facilitation Program payments. And the numbers that just showed up there on the screen is what the administration has reported they are spending on these commodities. So certainly soybeans at $1.65 a bushel has spent a significant amount, over $7 billion in just 2018. So let's run through some of the changes. One of the things I would note overall about the 2018 Farm Bill is that it's largely a status quo bill. That we didn't see massive changes, which historically speaking we would have expected in a lower price environment. The challenges for farmers and the challenges then for elected officials trying to write policy is that in these lower price environments, there's less flexibility and interest in making major changes to the bill. So let's start with crop insurance. The crop insurance baseline, what we had to operate with going into the debate, is here on the slide. You'll note that the bulk of the spending for crop insurance does come in premium subsidy. And this is a bit of a misnomer, a bit misnamed, because really premium subsidy is an offset. So the farmer pays for an insurance policy, and then part of that premium cost is offset by the federal program. And so while the bulk of the spending is there, this is not a traditional subsidy in the sense of a payment directly to the farmer. The main changes we've seen in crop insurance really are around the ability to combine your enterprise unit across county lines. So if you farm in 2 counties, you can combine your units now across that county line and be able to insure one enterprise unit. And the important thing for farmers, obviously, is this spreads the risk, but it should decrease the cost of your insurance policy. Excuse me. It should decrease the cost of your insurance policy. In addition, we've seen some changes around conservation issues, particularly cover crops, where we've defined the termination of a cover crop, and this is a practice that we adopt for nutrient loss reduction and soil health purposes between the fallow stretch. So after you harvest one crop and before you plant the next one. And what I think is important about this is we've now defined it as also part of good farming practices. So this should help farmers who are concerned that adopting this practice might impact their insurability. It should not impact your insurability. And so if you run into trouble because of weather on that cover crop termination, this should ease that concern. And it's also, I think, an important signal about changes in the policy to help improve things like soil health, help improve the nutrient loss and other items that have really been a challenge for farmers, and is a kind of discussion that's been developing around how we look at our policies and programs to make sure, at the very least, that we're not discouraging some of these practices and some of the innovation that we're seeing with many farmers out on the ground. So these are positive changes. When it comes to conservation programs, there's a slew of acronyms here, and I apologize for our overwhelming use of acronyms in this sector. But what we see on the chart are the main programs that operate in conservation. The first one is CRP, the Conservation Reserve Program. This is your traditional 10-year take an environmentally sensitive field out of production, and the landowner would receive an annual payment to keep it under a permanent cover conservation practice. This is a long-running program. The next one is CSP. This is the Conservation Stewardship Program. And in this one, it's a working lands program. So no acreage is taken out of production necessarily. What we're doing is we're making a 5-year annual payment to the farmer in return for having done enough conservation to get in the program, and then an agreement that over the 5-year life of that annual contract payment, that farmer will improve conservation across the entire farm. So it's very much an integration of conservation practices across the whole farm. EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, this is our working lands cost share program. Now, the bulk of this funding has been reserved for livestock operations, so you think things like manure management, but also the direct cost share on crop production to institute a practice. So maybe you put in a grass waterway, and the EQIP program provides an assistance by offsetting some of that cost. The next one here is the ACEP. This is the Agriculture Conservation Easement Program. So this is to put an easement, a permanent property right on the land, such as restoring and maintaining a wetland. So maybe I restore a wetland and I get an easement and payments for doing so. And then finally, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. This was created in 2014 to try to work across our sort of acronym silos, if you will, across these different programs, but also really to focus our conservation on a regional basis. So that what we are doing is thinking of conservation on a landscape scale, which is where the challenges really are. And so you can think of things like if you go out west where sage grouse efforts were underway or have been underway for a while, then you want to make sure you're not just doing individual fields, but that you're coordinating this across a land area that helps the sage grouse. So the two major changes that we've seen in the 2018 Farm Bill lease programs are on the CRP program. So Conservation Reserve has been, the acreage was reduced in 2014 and capped at 24 million acres nationwide. What we see in this program is a year-by-year step up to 27 million acres by 2023. Another key issue for landowners is that the rental rates available for CRP ground have also been capped going forward. So 85% of the county average rental rate is now the cap for CRP. And this was obviously designed to hold down the cost of expanding acres, but it was also in response to some concerns, particularly in the Midwest, where we saw high cash rent values get absorbed into the CRP program. And then as prices come down and there's financial pressure to really reduce spending at the farm level, you're now competing not just with other farmers for cash rent, but maybe with the CRP program that's got some pretty high cash rents in there. So this was it was designed to address that concern as well. It will likely shift CRP acres out of the Midwest. As you would imagine, you cap those rental rates, we're probably going to move some of the spending and acreage into the cheaper land values, relatively speaking, outside the heart of the I-state Corn Belt, for example. The other big change is around CSP. So the House of Representatives had proposed eliminating this program and rolling some of the funding and authorities into EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. The Senate did not do so, but in conference they negotiated around a compromise which does move funding and authorities and changes the way CSP will be funded, but it does try to decrease some of the complexities and challenges we saw in that program. And a lot remains to be seen exactly how that's going to work going forward with these two programs. In fact, we're anxiously waiting to see what USDA puts in the regulations for these programs to understand exactly how these two will work under the shared bucket of funds. But it will reduce funding. And one of the concerns we have here in a state like Illinois, where we are actively working to get nutrient loss reduction practices on the ground and cut the amount of nutrients that are getting into our waterways, these working land dollars are very important for that effort because that's going to help farmers manage through that additional cost challenge of adopting some of these practices. So we are watching closely to see how this gets rolled out by USDA and obviously want to make sure that some of these important acres where we're trying to reduce nutrient loss, that we're not losing that investment across the board. So more to come on that as we watch for the regulations. When it comes to Title I, the farm programs, the payment programs, of course, no reminder needed for farmers on the line, where we have seen prices in the last 10 to 15 years, that significant spike with the drought in 2012, but certainly the run up in prices under the renewable fuel standard beginning in 2005. We've come down a significant way, particularly significant compared to 2012. And that the forecast by CBO and USDA and pretty much everybody is that we will be at this lower price range, lower price scenario for the coming 5 to 10 years. And so that's shown here on this graph where we've been and where everybody's forecasting we're going to go right now. That forecast drives spending under programs. Price loss coverage is the PLC program. This is your traditional fixed price program. So for corn, we fixed the price in statute at $3.70 a bushel. If the market year average price for corn is below $3.70, it triggers a deficiency payment on the difference. So obviously a $3.50 market year average price would be a 20-cent deficiency paid on program yields and on base acres for the crop. Ark County is the blue bars here. This is the revenue-based program created in 2014. This runs on a county-wide 5-year Olympic moving average of yields and national moving average of prices. Of course, the Olympic moving average, as everybody probably remembers from sitting through any of the decision factors in 2014, is that 5-year average where we drop the highest and lowest years and then average the remaining 3. So it kind of smooths out the spikes and holds some of that assistance up as prices come down. What CBO is anticipating before the Farm Bill was passed, that a whole bunch of corn and soybean acres that had signed up for Ark County after 2014 in the lower price scenario we're looking at, almost all of those they expect to move into the price loss coverage program. And so you see the spending shift largely because of movements by corn and soybean, and to some degree wheat, into the PLC program. The 2014 Farm Bill, and this shows here the projected prices used in the next 5 years or the coming 5 years of the Farm Bill. Those are the solid lines. The dotted lines then are the reference price. So it's $8.40 for soybeans, $5.50 for wheat, and $3.70 for corn. As you can tell, wheat is expected to remain under that reference price for the entire 5 years, triggering payments under PLC each year. And certainly that would tell somebody with wheat base that they're going to want to be in the PLC program on their wheat base. Soybeans expected to be above it, except for 2019. This is largely that tariff impact. So 2019 would likely trigger payments for soybeans under PLC. And then corn, we're running right around that fixed reference price. And so the issue here for corn farmers is probably the toughest decision between the revenue program and PLC, but certainly that fixed price component is likely going to drive a lot of corn base into the PLC program as well. So we note that there's a choice between these two programs. This time the choice is only for 2 years, 2019 and 2020. And then farmers can reconsider their choice in 2021 through 2023. So each year after that, you can make a different choice between ARC and PLC, and that you're not held to it each year. So it's only a 2-year fixed choice or locked choice this time around. If you recall, 2014, you were locked all 5 years on your choice. And then the final issue, really in this new Farm Bill that we're going to watch but not expect any real change to come out of it, is that the PLC program now has what we call an escalator provision. And what that means is if this escalator provision runs at 85% of the 5-year Olympic moving average of the MYA prices. So it's very similar to the price calculation in the ARC County program. But what it does do is if any year that 85% of the moving average is above the reference price, then it's going to pull that reference price up to a cap on that, which is at 115%. So that's what's represented here. What we try to do, this is from a Farm Doc article a couple weeks ago, in which we ran a scenario that if there were 2 to 3 years of higher prices, how would that look? And you can see what it would do. It would pull that revenue or that reference price up. That's the blue line you see in front of you. You can see that if we looked backwards to 14, that would have been a higher reference price for the first few years. And then the green line is our market year average price, and so that where there were deficiency, we're triggering payments. So this would have triggered fairly significant payments under the 2014 Farm Bill if it had been in action. It wasn't, but going forward, what we need to see is a year or two of really high prices to pull up that moving average in order to get that above the 370. Given the price forecast, this is not going to happen, and it's not going to make any difference this time around, but it is a feature to keep in mind as you make your program decision. And that is the basics of the programs. Just some other things that do not get as much attention, but certainly are important policies for rural economic development, for trade and market access development, and foreign food aid, specialty crop pest and disease research. All of these are authorized by the Farm Bill, and it's part of a 12 to 13 title piece of legislation that's a big deal. And of course, I would be remiss as an employee of a federal land grant institute, a state land grant institute with federal funding, not to mention that all of our agricultural research is authorized through here, but funded by appropriators, and even the Forest Service is included in the Farm Bill. So quite a bit there. And then finally, the other big news out of this Farm Bill that everybody should be aware of, and of which we get a lot of questions about as we talk about Farm Bills, is that for the first time, this Farm Bill has included legalization of industrial hemp. So a couple quick items to this, and what is an incredibly unique inclusion in a Farm Bill. We have changed the Controlled Substances Act to legalize industrial hemp production, largely what will be driven by a state decision. So it's legalized federally, then kicked to the states to make a decision. We provide for research funding. We provide for crop insurance coverage, but it's going to be up to the state or the tribal government to apply to USDA with a plan for regulating hemp production in the state. And then once USDA signs off on the plan, then it becomes something that can be produced in the state. The other thing that the statute talks about is it defines what industrial hemp is, and so this is the brief summary of its definition. This is not marijuana. That is still illegal under the federal statute, although some states have legalized it. But hemp is defined as something that has less than 0.3% of the THC concentration. This is the psychedelic substance in marijuana. So very low THC. This is not the same plant, but this is going to be a potential new crop where states have been approved. And that obviously is an oil seed or potentially a fiber crop. So a lot to watch here, potential option in some of these states going forward. And we haven't seen too much more on the regs here, so we don't know exactly how some of these things are going to be required, but something to pay attention to. So that is the brief overview of 2018. I don't know if we've gotten any concerns or issues coming through. We don't see any questions yet, but Leanne, I'll take a moment to see if there's anything we need to catch up on here.
Absolutely. It looks like our attendees have leveled off, so I think everybody that wanted to join us, Jonathan, has joined. Why don't we take a moment to do just one polling question to get to know our audience? Does that make sense?
Great.
And we'll find out how many farmers or landowners or others are involved in today's webinar, and then we do actually have one additional question that came in. So a quick poll for attendees to answer. If you could select one of the following, which term describes you best? Are you a farmer, a landowner, a land professional, and under that umbrella we've included, if you're a real estate broker, an appraiser, a professional farm manager? Are you a lender or are you something else? That'll give us a flavor for who's in the audience. It's a nice day, so we may have a lot of farmers out in the field, and we'd love to learn a little bit more about the audience. So take a few moments to do that poll, and when the number of folks that have answered have leveled off, Jet, we'll go ahead and post the results. We'll just give you 30 to 45 seconds to chime in.
And do we have a question?
Great.
We did have one question related to if there's anything in the Farm Bill to do with irrigation.
Yeah, it's a good question. Irrigation, there's not a direct addressment of irrigation and water rights. That's usually at the state level. And certainly as you go out west, those issues increase in their intensity and importance. The closest we really get to it are going to be one in the conservation title. So the conservation title does provide assistance for irrigation, water quantity conservation, particularly in EQIP. It could also apply for CSP, again, depending on how those get set up. There is a change in the statute in the 2018 Farm Bill that would allow irrigation districts now to compete for funding, particularly under EQIP. So that's something we're going to watch to see how that plays out, if that ends up shifting funds to irrigation districts. The other way, crop insurance obviously going to insure a little bit differently for irrigated acres than dry land. And the farm programs themselves, ARC County does, in certain counties where you have about 25% or more of the acreage that is irrigated, they will run a separate irrigated yield at the county level for that. So there's a couple places where we touch it, and then of course there can be research funding and so forth. But I imagine the question is largely around conservation and farm programs, where we do have some provisions to adjust things based on the level of irrigation in the county.
Cool, great question. And keep those questions coming in throughout the webinar, and we'll be happy to address those. The poll results show, it looks like we have no results. So we're not sure what that means, but given the attendees, I'm assuming we have a nice mix of farmers, landowners, et cetera. So a little bit of a tech glitch there as well. Why don't we go ahead and close the poll? We'll go back to...
You're seeing no results. I'm seeing results on my end. 24% farmer, 35% landowner, 10% land professional, 7% lender, and then 24% other. So mostly landowners, farmers, and others.
Interesting. And we've got a fair number of other folks involved. So it's great to have a mix of individuals, and proves that I guess a lot of folks are interested in how the Farm Bill affects agriculture. Great.
Well, we will now dive into some history and development to lay some background to what we see in the 2018 Farm Bill and kind of how we got to this point. And this is a very brief overview of history, and so clearly there's a lot more to this, but I'm happy to take questions on it. If we look for the origin of the Farm Bill as we know it today, this is largely something developed out of the farm crisis we saw post-World War I, and this is a tracking of the market average prices as reported by USDA's National Agricultural Statistics Service, or NASS, for those years leading into World War I and then out of World War I. And then in 1929, as we know, the economy crashed into the Great Depression. And this is a picture of a penny auction in which neighboring landowners tried to protect the farm that was going under. Franklin Roosevelt was elected in 32 and ushered in the New Deal in 1933 once he was inaugurated. And the first Farm Bill, at least in terms of what we know a Farm Bill as of today, this direct assistance to farmers, was signed into law on May 13th, 1933 by Roosevelt as it passed through as part of his New Deal effort. The other major contributor to early farm policy was the Dust Bowl tragedy, the catastrophic situation in the southwestern plains in which massive drought and high winds on the high plains where we had plowed up a bunch of acres for wheat blew dust as far as the East Coast. And in response to that, we created some initial conservation policy around the Dust Bowl. The early era, in fact, the first 40 years of our attempts from 1933 to 1973, we largely look at this as a parity system in which what we were trying to do is use loan programs and acreage reduction or acreage allotments to reduce the amount of oversupply we had and increase the price to the farmer. So coming out of the Depression, the Dust Bowl, this New Deal system was largely designed to support prices and keep them high. This policy, to be perfectly blunt about it, failed miserably over the course of decades and resulted in pretty significant conflicts amongst the farm interest groups, between the regions, and particularly the Midwest and the South, and resulted in large stores of federally owned and managed grain supplies that have been forfeited under the loan program. And a price spike in the early 1970s pretty much put the failed parity system to rest as Congress switched over to target price income support policy. So we're triggering payments on low prices versus the loan program to do so. And one of the main reasons, there are quite a few reasons why parity failed, but one of them is that it's designed to control production, yield, or production through acreage. So we would reduce acres. So basically this is a heavy footprint from USDA in which we were controlling, which a farmer was given an allotment of acreage on how much they could plant to the crop. But post-World War II, we see this technological revolution. And this is something, as we're looking for lessons in history, here's something we kind of look back to. What happens in these massive changes in technology that improved yields in particular? So fertilizer, synthetic fertilizers coming out of World War II and the Haber-Bosch method, chemical inputs for controlling pests and disease, mechanization. For example, the first cotton picker was sold in 1942. And then, of course, genetics. And so over time, as we were trying to control production with acres, we were producing more and more per acre each year. And so this policy failed to control production. In fact, a great lesson is that you're not going to control production, and you're certainly not going to do it by limiting the acres planted to a crop. And you can see this chart here showing that increase over time. So you just see a massive increase post-World War II in our yields and our productive potential per acre. So, at one point, I think we would have had to cut wheat acres by almost 2/3 in order to keep production in line with where they estimated the demand was. So obviously the oversupply situation was significant running through this. As we move forward in time, we change out of the parity system into the target price system, beginning with the 1973 Agriculture and Consumer Protection Act. The other thing that's significant historically is that as the parity system broke down and as demographic trends throughout the nation, we witnessed a strong out-migration from farming and rural communities into cities and suburbs. That changes your vote, your districts. So we saw a lot of districts move out of rural, farm-dependent districts into suburban and urban districts. That changes your vote counts in Congress, and at the same time, we're fighting over policy. We ran into some real problems in the early 60s, And by 1964, the push from urban and suburban interests to get a food assistance program, food stamps, created. By 1964, the House of Representatives was kind of at a loggerheads on farm policy, and they didn't have the votes, and so they rolled together a vote to create the Food Stamp Act of 1964 with an attempt to fix some cotton and wheat policy issues. And that really begins this coalitional development, which was formalized in 1973 when that Agriculture and Consumer Protection Act both changed from parity to a target price system on the farm side and brought in food stamps as a permanent part of the Farm Bill legislation. This was controversial from the start. There's largely there's pretty heated debates about it in 73, and then it came under real pressure under the Reagan administration perspectives for government between 81 and 89. We also saw with this new policy and a push for expanded production, the fence row to fence row farming, the get big or get out. The way farmers expand, of course, is to borrow heavily. And so we saw a high amount of farm debt in the 70s, and then coupled with stagflation and energy crisis, embargoes on grain to the Soviet Union, really drove the farm economic crisis in the 1980s, in which we saw large payments under the target price system, and you can see the drop off in prices there on that chart. And then you combine the politics of the Reagan administration pushing spending reductions, and particularly on the food stamp side of the aisle, with the farm economic crisis, expanded production and erosion issues, with environmental concerns about soil erosion and water quality. And in 1985, the 1985 Food Security Act brings back in conservation in a way that has changed the policy going forward. So for the first time in 85, the conservation program created CRP and conservation compliance, which farmers' payments depend on being in compliance with wetlands, conservation restrictions, and highly erodible land requirements. And so that's a big change, particularly in the depths of the 80s farm crisis, to see that. And it's largely a political matter. We had to expand the coalition to get other interests in. The environmental concerns had grown drastically in the 70s with expanded production. And that coincided with an environmental movement that had gained a lot of political power. So you think the 70s was when we created the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, the 1970s when we passed the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and other environmental legislation. So this effort combined over time, and then by 85, we kind of solidified this three-part coalition. And this final chart just shows the increase in SNAP, or food stamps, during his lifetime since it was created in 64. A lot of this expansion was due initially to expanding it to all 50 states. So there's a slow rollout, if you will. And so as participation increased, spending increased. This also then, of course, increases political pressure. And then stagflation and economic problems in the 70s and early 80s certainly drove up participation and spending as well, further complicating our politics. If we put all 100 years in perspective, this will run us out through the full coalition as developed by 1985 with farm support, conservation assistance, and income food assistance. In 1996, another price spike and political challenges for the Farm Bill lead to the 96 Farm Bill, which decoupled farm policy. This is when we created our base acres, so that you're no longer paid, your government payment no longer is dependent on what you plant. It depends on the historical acreage for that farm. And this was really an attempt to try to avoid both the high spending we saw in the 80s in a low price environment, but also some of the complicated economic decision-making at the farm level. So if I'm in a low-price environment and I get a payment based on how much I plant and produce for that crop that's in a low-price environment, it may drive the farmer's decision of what to plant based on a payment, which then increases both the oversupplied and market trouble situation, but also increases federal spending. So decoupling this was a way to solve a long-running problem about the impact of the farm support system on the farmer's decision in the field. With decoupling, we also created working lands conservation, so the EQIP program dates to 1996 as well. As we run forward quickly in history, the next big thing we've seen develop here is not a Farm Bill issue, actually. It's the Renewable Fuel Standard, the RFS, first created in 2005 to require the transportation industry fuel suppliers, the oil and gas folks, to begin blending in renewable fuels. And largely that is corn-based ethanol in this country as both an oxygenate to improve the performance of the gasoline, but also to try to wean us off some of our heavy heavy national reliance on imported oil. So we created in 2005, increased the standard requirements, the mandates for blending in 2007. And this has been a significant boost in prices as we've seen the strong demand, upwards of 40% of the corn crop going into ethanol anymore, has driven up prices, at least until we get to this most recent environment in which high production and acreage has driven prices down, and what we've seen is another oversupply situation, particularly as that RFS is leveled out. And then the politics, in the polarized politics of recent years, have really complicated our efforts for this long-running effort in farm policy. So in 2013, the House of Representatives defeated a farm bill on the House floor. This was over a fight about SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and that was the first defeat for farm policy on the House floor since 1962. And that defeat in 1962 is what led us to get the food stamp program in action in '64. So a lot of those politics there. And then we did not learn the lesson very well in the House again. In 2018, a fight over SNAP caused a pretty significant partisan split on the House version of the Farm Bill in 18, and an initial defeat before they re-voted a second time in 2018 and got it passed. So what we do see is that the complications for maintaining a coalition in a difficult political environment can really upend our efforts to get a bill through. So that steps us into some basic takeaway lessons from history, and then we'll go to questions here after this. So what we do know more than anything from history is the importance of building a coalition votes you need to pass. And we often talk about the first and last rule of legislating is count your votes. How many do I have on my side? How many are against me? And how can I obviously improve my chances? All great ideas and policy will suffer without enough votes to get them through Congress. That's 218 votes in the House and usually 60 in the Senate. So we start our coalition building back in the 20s around that regional traditional coalition, and the regional politics involved among the three major crops: corn, wheat, and cotton. We've learned painfully that production control is illusory at best, and that might just be the nicest way to say that it doesn't work. And the policy built around production control, it will fail. And we also know from history that prices dominate the policy debate discussion, as we can see around what has just happened in the last two farm bills with the price loss coverage program. The chart that I have here on the side is just an acreage planted as reported by USDA. The main thing you can see are the significant increase in soybean acres over time, and some of this is due to the freeing up of farmer decision levels after the allotments, and then of course with the 96 bill. We've seen reductions in wheat acres and significant reductions in cotton over the years, and the cotton reduction specifically ties to policy that pushed out cotton acres early on. And the other thing we know about maintaining coalitions and getting votes, so this is the 2016 presidential election, a three-dimensional map created by Princeton that looks at, so these towers are the vote density, the number of voters in a county. So the higher the tower, obviously the higher number of votes. And we in rural America know certainly some of the challenges here when we think of a democracy and the issues around counting votes and how that plays out in our politics. What this has done, obviously, has been a big driver of the reason for food stamp, or now SNAP, assistance in the Farm Bill. Frankly, there are not enough farm-dependent counties, let alone congressional districts, to push a farm bill through Congress on its own. And so this map is USDA's report of farm-dependent counties across the country. And this has been going on for a long time. This predates farm bills. This predates the Great Depression even. But that out-migration from farming in rural communities continues to cause lots of challenges at the local level in rural communities. But it drives a lot of the politics. And of course, all the politics around dealing with poverty are significant and challenging, and oftentimes highly charged political questions. And then votes and interest groups and all of that. So we can think about sort of what do we learn in trying to bridge the rural urban suburban divides in this country, and how does that play out both in recent times, but really as we look forward to upcoming elections and upcoming farm bills. The final map here is as reported by the Food and Research Action Council using USDA data for SNAP. And this is intended to remind us that food assistance is a nationwide policy. It's also important, it often gets termed as a city or urban program, but there are high levels of SNAP participation in many rural counties, particularly as the rural economy has struggled and jobs have left as factories ship overseas. So we do see some pretty strong need for food stamps or SNAP benefits in rural counties. So this is a program, while certainly benefits a lot of people in urban and suburban areas, it is important in rural counties as well, and something we probably would be wise to remember as we go forward with our Farm Bill efforts. And finally, conservation, the third leg of this coalition. You know, if we look back over history, we know we kind of got started under this with the Dust Bowl era and the devastation out west. We know that the erosion challenges in the target price era beginning in the 70s and this fence row to fence row expanded production led to the 85 Act's inclusion of CRP and compliance. And then I mentioned earlier the nutrient loss challenge. So if we think of ourselves in the RFS era, post-2005, we've seen expanded acreage, we've got genetic engineering technology that helps with yields, but we've seen a high level of nutrients being exported or lost from these fields, getting into the waterways. And this is a map of the Mississippi River Basin, which feeds the hypoxic or dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, and has resulted in this strong push at the state level to get conservation practices on the field and get nutrient reduction efforts statewide to reduce the loading of these nutrients, particularly nitrogen in a state like Illinois where we're losing it through tile lines. And the real question this raises, you know, we've addressed conservation challenges in the past, but the scope and scale of the nutrient loss issue is different than what we've seen before, because we're talking about productive, in some cases highly productive farmland that you're not going to take out of production with CRP, that is huge acreage footprints and high value and high productivity. So how do our policies need to change in this new environment to address this issue and help reduce nutrient loss? And I think it's going to be a big driving question for conservation policy, if not all farm policy going forward. And finally, our budget situation has been a huge political matter. I mentioned the discipline. This is CBO's chart of the percentage of our gross domestic product that is the federal debt held by the public. You can see the spikes in war and depression, and then where they project it to go in the future, which is nearly going off the charts going forward. If we look at CBO's report of revenues and outlays, we can see this is the deficit. So each year that outlays, the red bars exceed revenues, the green chunk there, that is when we run the federal deficit, and then each year of deficit adds to the debt, of course. So these two things have been big political factors. It's interesting to note we've been trying to discipline our budget at the federal level with congressional statutes since 1974, largely in response to the Nixon administration's use of impoundment authority, which echoes with the current national emergency declaration by the Trump administration. In the 80s, we used something called reconciliation, which were instructions to committees to cut spending. We tried to discipline spending with the Graham-Rudman-Hollings bill in 85, and 95 again reconciliation. And as we jump forward, we've been using reconciliation and then sequestration from 2011. So all of these things to try to address the budget challenges that have, well, if you measure by terms of debt and deficit, have not succeeded thus far. And what they have done is complicate our politics. So we think of the Farm Bill as a window into this issue. We've got our farm assistance spending. So here's total crop support, including crop insurance and disaster, and total conservation. Compare that, and these are not to scale, obviously, compare that to the food assistance spending. So holding together this coalition is a challenge in normal political times, is a challenge for politics. That's part of how we work in our system of government. But when you do so with budget pressures, now we think of the where the coalition comes together, that's where our fault lines are. Now you're putting budget pressure on those fault lines and stressing the agreements that work across these interest areas. It creates a zero-sum game, as I mentioned early on with the baseline. You only have so much to spend, and increasing in one area requires cuts elsewhere, and so you're creating this competition for spending, and it changes the legislative process. And of course, as we've seen all too painfully, this will magnify the ideological and partisan conflicts in Congress, because my priorities are now under pressure by you, and you're trying to protect your priorities, and so we get into some pretty nasty debates. So where does this leave us? Well, anybody's guess is a good guess at this point. What I think we look at, both taking in history, budget, and demographic changes and politics, is if we step back a little bit, we have three major spending items for farmers. The direct payment programs of the Title I farm programs, the conservation assistance, and crop insurance. We're spreading our spending across three items, three agencies serving the same group of farmers under a budget and political set of pressures that really are driving some challenges. And we know we place a lot of emphasis on price risk with the programs, but with conservation challenges and the scale and scope of some of these, like nutrient loss and limited funds and difficult politics, how is it that we start to think across some of these divided silos, if you will, for policy into the future? How do we start thinking about insurance and payment programs with conservation considerations, but also conservation programs with better risk management considerations? How do these conservation policies respond to low prices? So what matters most, and sort of looking forward with a quick summary here, the financial and risk management are certainly big issues, and certainly in times of change. We're seeing more and more pressure from the consuming public about how their food is produced and what sustainability measures that can be put on a label or on a smartphone as you go through the aisle. This creates new management challenges both for the food supply industry as well as the farmers. We are seeing massive, and great example of this with granular and other technological opportunities. How does that factor into our risks and the challenges for farmers? And then we've mentioned quite a bit the political risks or political challenges with partisan polarization in the budget. So, as we think about policies into the future, do we start to see this conversation work around what is not only assisting the farmer with risks, but provides a return to the taxpayer or the voter in terms of things like nutrient loss reduction and conservation issues? And so these are some of the questions or issues I think we're going to continue to debate in our always fun political process. And I guess with this, we'll turn to questions and answers, and a shameless plug for those who enjoy the history or just need something to put them to sleep at night. As Leanne mentioned, I got a book that came out in December, The Fault Lines. Here's a picture of the cover. It's available from University of Nebraska Press. And with that, again, I thank Granular and Leanne and the team, and for everybody who tuned in today for this presentation.
No, absolutely. We certainly appreciate you as well. Yes, we will pick three folks from the attendees today, and expect to see a copy of Jonathan's new book in the mail. So that's fabulous. We have had 5 or 6 questions come in, and actually several questions about hemp. In addition to some other factors, and I'll just read these verbatim, and we can kind of go from there. But do you have any additional clarification on how the trend adjustment factor will be determined or used?
So that's a great question, very specific question on the ARC County program, and one of the changes to that program, as I mentioned, it has used in the past a 5-year historic county average yield on that Olympic moving average. The 18 Farm Bill changes that to use a trend-adjusted yield. So one of the things we found in the 2014 operation of the program that is obvious, but is a challenge for writing the policy, is this issue that you expect that our expectation, our risk management expects that crop yields improve every year, whereas prices are much more volatile up and down. So this is an effort to improve the yield part of that calculation. We have yet to see FSA's regulation on how they're going to incorporate it, but the statute reads basically they're going to take the trend-adjusted yield used by crop insurance and use it as a plug-in. So anytime your yields are below that trend-adjusted yield, it's going to play right into the ARC County calculation. There's a few details in that we still would like to see before we go too far with it about exactly how they're going to operate it, but largely we can expect it to improve the yield component of that ARC County calculation. And is an important factor as farmers, particularly where it's a close call like with corn, how's that going to look if we have a better yield component in that protection that the program provides.
Fabulous. Since we have a fair number of landowners involved in today's webinar, I know that the Farm Bill expanded the definition of actively engaged in management to sort of reflect more modern farming practices. Could you address the major factors there, Jonathan? You think our audience would be important to our audience?
So a couple of things. This has been a long-running debate, frankly, about not making farm payments to individuals who are not farming and not allowing certain operations to expand the number of payments they can receive by adding people to an operation. Usually a general partnership is the way that that's been done. The 2014 Farm Bill tried to limit that. It moved it down to USDA, and the USDA then cut that to only three managers non-related managers could be added to get additional payments. This Farm Bill expanded that a little bit in terms of family. So what it does is it increases the number of people who can be considered a member of the family and receive payments to first cousins and aunts and uncles, I believe. So it's a little bit of a family expansion, but largely the limits around managers should continue as they have in the last few years.
Fabulous. We got started a little after 11, so why don't we take one or two more questions if that
sure,
works, and then we'll end. One question was whether you could address what's in the mind of policymakers regarding the key driver for declining farm income.
What is the key driver for declining farm? In the policy realm, it's largely built around these prices, right? That's what they are focused on. That's where the debate has been around. This has consumed this farm policy debate for a while. In fact, the 2014 Farm Bill, if you recall, the 3-year effort that took to write that one, there was a big debate in the Senate, quite a bit of conflict between the regions about whether or not we'd continue the fixed price or we'd use these moving averages to calculate the level of assistance. And so in a lower price environment, the fixed price clearly has sort of a policy preference. But we've been using that a lot. You see in the revenue program and crop insurance in particular, more use of revenue, so prices times a yield number that has driven some of this as well. And I think part of this looking forward is considering that revenue or that farm income situation when it comes to things like conservation policy, because that is often an added cost, the benefits of which may not come back to the farmer or the landowner until multiple years of the practice. So it begins to really, I think, drive some of the conservation discussion, or should be driving the conservation policy discussion as well, and how you help farmers manage the cost, the declining income challenges, as well as the conservation requirements or demands.
Okay, fabulous. One final question, then we'll sum up. Is there going to be pressure coming from the consumer community regarding food safety that you think may impact or influence future policy?
Yeah, then there's certainly significant pressure for food safety. Now, I should clarify, a lot of what we talk about in this Farm Bill are the bulk commodities, the corn, the wheat, the soybeans. So the food safety issues there are far less because they're processed or fed. But as we've seen expansion of organic production, expansion of these local producers and farmers markets, and certainly consumer demand for healthier food and more vegetables and fruits, that those food safety issues have come into play. Congress did try to address it with the Food Safety Modernization Act a few years ago, and that deals, USDA and the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, both have some responsibility in this space. So I think we're going to see that as a continued demand, and it will spike every time we have something like the romaine lettuce incident here recently.
Absolutely.
Where we do see people unfortunately getting sick from some food safety issues. And I think that's going to continue. I think it's going to be fascinating to see how we incorporate technology into these things more and more. Since we are sitting at a tech company in the beautiful open spaces here, right? I think we are seeing a significant technological change and shift happening, and that raises questions about how the technology is going to help or be used in terms of risk management, in terms of conservation and sustainability measures, things like the field to market effort, for example, the ability to map your fields. And certainly food safety. I mean, being able to track this back, being able to kind of have a running ability to know which farm produced which crop, and if nothing else, should help us isolate where the incidences of food safety have come from, and maybe avoid some of the market-wide shutdowns like we saw with romaine.
Right.
So that could have a big impact where technology really helps us in our food safety system. But obviously, a lot of adoption questions on that and how that's going to work and whatnot. But these data-driven potential, the data-driven potential out there, I think, is significant. And as we incorporate more technology, it's going to have impacts across the board. And while slowly, will likely impact policy down the road as well. So we're watching that. For example, this Farm Bill had some provisions about data collection for USDA for crop insurance and programs and conservation. So, we can see that begin to get incorporated more and more.
Okay, wonderful.
That way.
With that, it's a few minutes after 12. Jonathan, we have a couple of additional questions, but would it make sense for us to follow up with these folks afterward? Can we do that? Can I facilitate that?
Absolutely.
Okay, that sounds great.
And I certainly have got my email address up there. I'm always happy to take questions if you have any that come out of this, and forward them to me.
Perfect. That sounds.
And we, shameless
wonderful.
plug time. In addition to the book, we also Farm Doc Daily, here operated by faculty here at the University of Illinois. We produce a daily article on farm economic and policy issues. So that's a great place to also look for some other additional information, and we will continue to update as we know more about the programs and policies from the Farm Bill.
Wonderful, a great resource for farmers and landowners. So with that, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everybody for participating, and in particular, thank you for coming, Jonathan, and sharing your knowledge and perspective. We will, for those interested, be sharing a link to the webinar video as well as the slide set, if that's fine with you. And if anybody has any additional questions, again, feel free to reach out to Jonathan or to myself, and we'll be sure to try to get those answered or addressed for you. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, have a wonderful day, and thank you for your participation.
And thank you.